What if the man you abandoned didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't chase you when you returned? He simply gathered his evidence, hired a lawyer, and ended your marriage with one signature. What if all your excuses and tears meant nothing once he decided he was done forever? I told myself I was only leaving for a little while, that Daniel would understand once I explained everything, that he would see it wasn't about abandoning him, but about helping someone who needed me more. Mark had called crying about losing his job, about his life falling apart, about how no one else cared, and I told Daniel I couldn't just stand by and do nothing. He asked why it had to be me, why I was willing to throw away our marriage to rescue a man who'd left me years ago. And I said he was being selfish and controlling when all I wanted was to help a friend. Rebecca agreed with me, told me I was right to follow my heart, that Daniel had become cold and distant anyway, so maybe a little space would fix everything. Lydia looked at me like I was tearing her son's life apart on purpose, but I told her she was overreacting. Emily cried when I packed my things, but I told her she wouldn't understand until she was older. I left thinking Daniel would wait for me, that he would always be there, that no matter what happened, he would never actually walk away. I left on a Tuesday morning when the sky was grey and heavy, the kind of weather that made everything feel slower, softer, easier to ignore. Daniel stood in the doorway while I packed my things into 2 suitcases, his face unreadable, his hands shoved into the pockets of the same jacket he wore every morning to work. He asked if I was sure about this, his voice even, almost too calm, and I told him I needed time to think, that maybe he would finally appreciate me if I wasn't here for a while. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or call me selfish the way Rebecca had warned me he might. He just stood there watching as I closed the suitcase and told Emily I would call her every night, that this wasn't permanent, that sometimes people needed space before they could be happy again. She didn't say anything back. She just nodded and held her stuffed rabbit a little tighter, while Daniel told her to grab her backpack so he could drive her to school. When Mark picked me up outside the house, I made sure the neighbors saw, not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted people to know someone was willing to fight for me, even if it wasn't my husband. Mark smiled like this was all romantic, like I was choosing him because of love instead of boredom, and I let him think that because it sounded better than the truth. We drove to his apartment on the other side of town, the place smaller than I remembered, the furniture mismatched, and the air smelling faintly of paint and dust. He said it wasn't much, but it was ours now, and I told him not to worry, because I wasn't planning on staying forever, just long enough to help him get back on his feet. He nodded like he understood, but I could see in his eyes he was already building a different story in his head, one where I left Daniel because I couldn't live without him. The first week passed easily enough. Mark talked about looking for work while I called Rebecca every evening, to tell her Daniel hadn't said a word to me since I left. She said that proved he didn't care, that a man who loved his wife wouldn't stay silent while she lived with someone else. And I told her she was right, that maybe Daniel really had stopped loving me a long time ago. She said I deserved someone who fought for me, someone who made me feel alive. And I didn't tell her that Mark mostly slept until noon and spent his afternoon scrolling through his phone like work would magically appear if he stared long enough. On the 3rd weekend, Lydia called and asked if I planned on coming back home or if Daniel should start talking to a lawyer. I told her she was being dramatic, that marriages had rough patches, that she needed to stay out of things she didn't understand. She said Daniel was quieter than usual, that Emily was confused and hurt, that people were starting to ask questions about why I had left with Mark like I was some rebellious teenager instead of a grown woman with a child at home. I told her people love to gossip and that maybe if Daniel had been more attentive, none of this would have happened. She said Daniel worked 2 jobs to keep the house running, and that calling him inattentive was an insult after everything he had done for me. I hung up before she could finish. Meanwhile, Mark kept saying he would apply for jobs next week, that things would turn around soon, that he just needed time to figure things out. I told Rebecca he was trying, that he just needed support, that Daniel never understood how to be emotionally available the way Mark did. She said maybe I had made the right choice leaving, that sometimes women needed to follow their hearts, no matter what people thought. I didn't tell her that Mark's version of emotional support mostly involved me paying for groceries while he stayed home watching TV. One evening, I drove back to the old neighborhood to drop off some of Emily's things she had left behind at Mark's apartment during a weekend visit. Daniel met me in the driveway, calm as ever, taking the box out of my hands without looking at me for more than a second. He asked if Emily had eaten dinner, and I said yes, waiting for him to ask when I was coming home, when we were going to fix things, when I was going to stop living like this. He didn't ask. He just told Emily to grab her backpack from the car and take it inside, while he stood there holding the box like it weighed nothing at all. Rebecca said later that maybe Daniel was in shock, that men didn't know how to handle things like this, that he was probably bottling it all up until he finally exploded. I told her Daniel didn't explode. Daniel shut doors quietly and paid bills on time and never left dishes in the sink. And that was the problem. He was predictable, steady, impossible to provoke, and I wanted someone who actually reacted when things fell apart. Mark kept saying he loved me for choosing him, for leaving my whole life behind to be with him. And I didn't tell him that part of me was starting to wonder why Daniel hadn't even tried to stop me. At the end of the first month, when I saw Daniel at the grocery store buying milk and bread like nothing in the world had changed, I told Rebecca he was heartless. She said maybe he was just done chasing someone who didn't want to be caught, and for the first time since I left, I didn't have a quick answer ready. By the second month, people had stopped pretending not to talk about me. At the cafe near Rebecca's office, I heard my own name at the next table when two women whispered about how I had left Daniel for that guy with no job, like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away stirring my coffee. Rebecca told me to ignore them, that people always turned marriages into public entertainment, but I couldn't help noticing how quickly the story had spread. At work, someone asked casually if Daniel was doing okay, and when I said I hadn't talked to him much lately, they gave me the kind of look people save for bad decisions they're too polite to comment on. I told myself it didn't matter, that people would get bored eventually, that I had done the right thing by leaving a man who made life feel like one long list of chores and bills. Mark wasn't helping my case. He kept saying he was applying for jobs, but there was never an interview, never a callback, never any real sign that things were going to change. He slept late, complained about how Daniel was probably telling everyone he was some kind of freeloader, and said I shouldn't care what people thought as long as we knew the truth. I told him the truth was he needed to start paying for his own groceries before my savings ran out, and he promised he would soon, the same way he promised every week. Rebecca told me to be patient, that men needed time to rebuild after setbacks, that Mark just needed encouragement, not pressure. I didn't tell her that when I asked him to pick Emily up from school one afternoon while I was stuck at work, he forgot completely, and I had to leave early to get her myself. Daniel said nothing about it when I dropped her off at his house that evening. He stood in the doorway while Emily ran inside, carrying her backpack, his face calm and unreadable as always. I wanted him to ask why I was still living with Mark, when I planned on coming back, what exactly I thought I was doing with my life, but he just thanked me for bringing Emily home on time and said she had homework to finish before dinner. I told Rebecca later that he was acting like a robot, like none of this mattered to him, like he was perfectly fine raising our daughter while I lived across town with another man. She said maybe he was waiting for me to realize I'd made a mistake, that men like Daniel didn't beg. They just stayed quiet until you came to your senses. At family gatherings, the tension was thick enough to choke on. Lydia refused to speak to me at all, focusing on Emily and Daniel like I wasn't even in the room. When I told Rebecca that Lydia was turning everyone against me, she said Lydia was just protective of her son, and I shouldn't take it personally. But it was hard not to when I overheard Lydia telling someone in the kitchen that Daniel deserved better, that he shouldn't take me back even if I begged. I told Rebecca later that Lydia had hated me since the day I married her son, that she was probably thrilled to have a reason to push me out of the family for good. Meanwhile, Mark kept asking why I cared so much about what Daniel's family thought. He said I had chosen him, that I should stop worrying about people who clearly didn't want me around anymore. I told him it wasn't that simple, that Emily was still my daughter, that I wasn't going to let Lydia raise her like I didn't exist. He said Daniel would never keep Emily from me, that men like him were too predictable to fight dirty. I wanted to believe that, But the way Daniel stayed silent through everything made me uneasy, like he was waiting for the perfect moment to do something I wouldn't see coming. One night when I picked Emily up for the weekend, she asked quietly if I was ever coming home for good. I told her I just needed to help Mark get back on his feet first, that once things were stable, we could all go back to normal. She didn't say anything after that, just looked out the car window like she didn't believe me. Later, Rebecca said kids were resilient, that Emily would be fine as long as both parents loved her, but even she sounded less certain than usual. On Monday, I found out through a co-worker that Daniel had been seen at a law office downtown, talking to someone in a suit with a folder full of papers. When I mentioned it to Rebecca, she said it was probably about taxes or insurance, that Daniel wasn't the type to start legal trouble unless I gave him a reason. I told her I hadn't done anything wrong because technically I hadn't filed for divorce. Technically I was just living somewhere else. Technically the marriage was still intact. She said then I had nothing to worry about, but the word technically stuck in my head the rest of the night like a warning I didn't want to hear. By the end of that week, even Mark started hinting that maybe Daniel was planning something, that quiet men didn't stay quiet forever, that I should probably talk to him before things got messy. I told him Daniel wasn't like that he wouldn't do anything drastic, that he didn't have the courage to change his own routine, let alone anyone else's life. But later, when I dropped Emily off and saw Lydia's car in the driveway, and Daniel talking to her in low voices I couldn't quite hear, I felt something cold settle in my stomach for the first time since I left. By the third month, everything started to blur together, the days feeling heavy and restless, Mark still drifting between promises and excuses, while Daniel stayed silent like he was watching a storm form from a distance. When I found out I was pregnant, it didn't feel real at first. I sat in the bathroom of Mark's apartment, holding the test like it was a letter written in a language I didn't understand, my heart pounding, while Mark paced the hallway, asking what I planned to do. I told him I didn't know, that things were already complicated enough, that maybe this would finally make Daniel understand I needed support, not judgment. Mark didn't say much after that, just muttered something about needing fresh air before leaving for the rest of the afternoon. Rebecca was the first person I told. She said maybe this was the push everyone needed to forgive and forget, that families always rallied when children were involved, that even Daniel wouldn't stay angry once he realized there was a baby on the way. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think this news would fix everything, that Daniel would open the door, take me back, stop looking at me like I was a stranger walking through his house to drop off our daughter every other weekend. When I told Daniel, he didn't react the way I expected. He stood there in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee while I explained everything, his face calm, his eyes steady, his voice quiet when he finally said he understood. That was it. He understood. No anger, no accusations, no demands for explanations about who the father was. He just nodded like I had told him the weather forecast and said he would clear out the guest room if I needed a place to stay for a while. I told Rebecca later that his reaction proved he still loved me, that he was willing to move past everything for the sake of the baby, for the sake of Emily, for the sake of the family we had almost destroyed. She said maybe this was my chance to rebuild things, that Daniel clearly wasn't the kind of man who held grudges forever. I didn't tell her that when I moved back into the house a week later, Daniel barely spoke to me beyond the basics of bills, groceries, and Emily's school schedule. He slept in the master bedroom while I stayed in the guest room, the distance between us feeling wider than it had when I was living across town. Lydia refused to come over at all once she heard I had moved back in. She told Rebecca that Daniel was making a mistake letting me stay, that I would only bring more chaos into the house, that Emily deserved better than to watch her parents play whatever game this was turning into. I told Rebecca Lydia had always hated me, that she just wanted Daniel to raise Emily alone so she could play perfect grandmother without me around. Rebecca didn't answer right away this time, just said Lydia had a right to be protective after everything that had happened. Emily stayed quiet most evenings, eating dinner at the table with Daniel, while I sat across from them, trying to make conversation that went nowhere. She answered questions with 1 or 2 words, spent most of her time in her room or at friends' houses, avoided me when she could. When I told Rebecca it was just a phase, She said kids were smarter than people gave them credit for, that Emily probably understood more than I realized. I didn't like the sound of that, but I didn't know how to change it either. Mark stopped calling after the first few weeks back at Daniel's house. He sent one message asking if I was okay, another asking if I needed money, then nothing at all after I didn't answer either one. Rebecca said it was for the best, that I needed to focus on my family now, that Mark had been nothing but trouble from the start. I told her Mark hadn't been the problem, that Daniel's coldness had pushed me towards someone who actually paid attention. But even as I said it, the words felt thin and tired, like excuses I didn't fully believe anymore. One evening, I saw Daniel coming out of the bank downtown when I was driving Emily home from school. He didn't see us, just walked across the parking lot carrying a folder under his arm before getting into his car and leaving. I told Rebecca later, and she said he was probably sorting out savings for the new baby, that he was being responsible the way he always was, but the way he kept everything so quiet made something in my chest tighten. At home, Daniel started keeping more papers in his office, the door closed when he was inside, his voice low when he made phone calls after dinner. When I asked what he was working on, he said taxes, insurance, things for the baby, answers so ordinary it felt ridiculous to question them. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting under the surface, something I wasn't being told. By the end of the month, I convinced myself things were getting better because Daniel hadn't asked me to leave. He let me stay in the house, let me eat at his table, let me exist in his life like nothing final had been decided yet. But when I walked past his office late one night and saw him sliding a stack of papers into a locked drawer before turning off the light, the certainty I kept clinging to felt suddenly very thin. Lydia finally decided to host a family dinner near the end of the 4th month, saying it was time for everyone to sit down together and act like adults. Rebecca told me it was a chance to show things were improving, that Daniel and I could prove the family wasn't falling apart after all. I agreed because part of me wanted to believe it too, that if everyone saw us sitting at the same table, eating the same meal, they would stop whispering about mistakes and failures and start believing in second chances. Daniel said nothing when I told him about the dinner, just nodded like it didn't matter one way or the other, his face calm as ever, while Emily looked up from her homework without saying a word. At Lydia's house, the table was already set when we arrived, the smell of roasted chicken and potatoes filling the air, the kind of dinner she used to host for birthdays and holidays, back when things felt normal. Lydia greeted Emily warmly, hugged Daniel briefly, and gave me the kind of polite smile people give strangers they have no intention of speaking to for longer than necessary. I told myself it didn't matter, that tonight was about family unity, that people just needed to see us together again. We ate mostly in silence at first, the sound of forks on plates louder than the conversations. Lydia asked Emily about school, asked Daniel about work, asked Rebecca about her new apartment, but she didn't ask me anything at all. I told Rebecca later that Lydia was being petty, that she wanted everyone to think I was some outsider who didn't belong anymore, and Rebecca said maybe Lydia just needed more time. I didn't tell her about the look Lydia gave me when I mentioned the baby, the way her mouth tightened like she had swallowed something bitter. Halfway through the meal, I tried to lighten the mood, telling a story about work, exaggerating a few details to make it funny, something about a mix-up with schedules that had everyone running in circles for an entire afternoon. Rebecca smiled politely, Emily barely looked up, Daniel kept eating, and Lydia finally said maybe some people should focus on their own households instead of laughing about other people's mistakes. The table went quiet after that. I told Rebecca later that Lydia was poisoning the whole family against me, that she wanted everyone to believe I was some villain while Daniel played the quiet, suffering hero. Rebecca didn't agree or disagree, just said people had long memories when it came to marriage problems, that gossip always traveled faster than the truth. I said the truth was that Daniel had pushed me away long before I ever left, that no one wanted to talk about his coldness or the way he spent more time at work than at home. She said maybe people didn't see it that way because Daniel never defended himself, never explained anything, never gave anyone details to argue about. After dinner, Daniel left early, saying he had paperwork to finish before the weekend. Lydia looked satisfied watching him go, like she had been waiting for proof that he was the responsible one, the stable one, the one who would handle everything properly when the time came. Emily left with him, saying she had homework to finish, and I stayed behind with Rebecca helping clear the dishes, while Lydia talked in the kitchen with her neighbor about how proud she was of Daniel for staying calm through everything. I told Rebecca Lydia was doing it on purpose, that she wanted me to hear every word, and Rebecca said maybe Lydia just wasn't ready to forgive yet. The next morning, I noticed Daniel had moved more boxes into his office at home, stacking them near the filing cabinet where he kept the drawer locked. When I asked what it was, he said bank statements, insurance forms, things for the baby, the same ordinary explanations he always gave. I told Rebecca about it later, and she said at least he was being responsible, that it meant he was planning for the future. I didn't tell her about the folder I saw sticking out of one box with the name of a law firm printed neatly across the top. Emily grew quieter as the days passed, spending most of her time in her room or at Lydia's house when she wasn't with friends. When I asked if something was wrong, she just shrugged and said she had homework. Rebecca said kids didn't like drama, that Emily probably just needed things to calm down, but I wondered if maybe she already knew what I was starting to suspect, that Daniel wasn't just organizing paperwork, that something bigger was coming, something he wasn't ready to say out loud yet. One evening when Daniel came home later than usual, I asked if he had been at the office again. He said yes without looking at me, setting his keys on the counter before disappearing into his study with another stack of folders. I told Rebecca it was probably about taxes, that he was the kind of man who planned everything months in advance, but even she sounded unsure this time, asking if I was certain it wasn't about something else. By the end of the week, I caught a glimpse of him at the dining table late at night, the house quiet, while he sorted through papers, signing some, setting others aside in neat piles, like each one belonged to a separate part of a plan I wasn't being told about. He didn't notice me standing in the hallway watching, or maybe he did and just didn't care anymore, because he didn't close the folder when I walked past. He just kept working, calm and steady, like someone preparing for a storm he already knew was coming. The papers arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a man in a dark suit who asked for me by name, while Emily sat at the kitchen table working on her homework. He handed me a large envelope without explanation, nodded politely, and left before I could ask anything. I opened it expecting something about taxes or insurance the way Daniel always claimed, but the words across the top read, "Petition for dissolution of marriage," in bold letters that made my stomach twist. There were more pages, custody agreements, financial disclosures, even a list of assets I didn't realize Daniel had moved out of our joint accounts. Every page had dates, signatures, and legal stamps like this had all been planned carefully, long before I saw the first sheet of paper. When Daniel came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room, holding the envelope like it might burst into flames. He walked past me, calm as always, setting his keys on the counter before telling Emily to finish her homework before dinner. I demanded to know what this was, why he hadn't said anything, why he thought lawyers and paperwork were better than a single conversation with his own wife. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look angry, didn't even seem surprised by my reaction. He just said everything was explained in the documents, that there was nothing more to discuss until the court date. I called Rebecca as soon as he went into his office, my hands shaking, while I told her Daniel had filed for divorce and custody, like I was some stranger who had broken into his life instead of the woman he had been married to for 12 years. She asked what exactly the papers said, and when I told her, she went quiet for a long moment before saying, maybe Daniel had been planning this since I left. Maybe he had been waiting for the right moment to do everything properly, so there would be nothing for me to fight against. I told her that was ridiculous, that Daniel wasn't cold enough to plan something like this behind my back. But even as I said it, I remembered the locked drawers, the late nights at his office, the meetings at the law firm I had convinced myself were about taxes. Lydia called the next day, her voice calm but sharp, as she said Daniel was doing what needed to be done, that he was thinking about Emily first, that he was making sure everything was handled legally, so there wouldn't be years of fighting afterward. I told her she had poisoned him against me, that she had been waiting for me to make one mistake so she could push me out of the family for good. She said I had made more than one mistake and hung up before I could answer. Mark texted that evening for the first time in weeks, saying he had heard about the papers through someone we both knew. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't expected Daniel to go this far, that maybe we could figure things out together. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it without replying. Even Rebecca said getting Mark involved now would only make things worse, that I needed to focus on what Daniel was planning before the court made everything final. Daniel stayed quiet through it all. He took Emily to school, went to work, came home for dinner, sorted papers in his office, spoke to his lawyer on the phone behind a closed door, and acted like my anger, my questions, my panic didn't touch him at all. When I told him we should talk before things went too far, he said the time for talking had passed, that everything we needed to say would be handled through the lawyers now. Rebecca came over one evening trying to reason with him, saying maybe things didn't have to end like this, that we could work something out privately, that Emily didn't need a courtroom deciding her future. Daniel listened politely before telling her he was following the law exactly as it was written, that this was the cleanest way to handle a situation that had been messy for too long. He said Emily deserved stability, that the baby deserved clarity, that he wasn't going to leave anything uncertain for the sake of avoiding paperwork. I told Rebecca later that he was being cruel, that this was punishment disguised as responsibility, that he wanted to humiliate me by making everything public. She said maybe he just wanted to be done with the chaos, that maybe he didn't want to fight anymore, because fighting meant there was still something left to save. I hated the way that sounded because it felt too close to the truth. The following week, another envelope arrived, this one with court dates, financial statements, and custody recommendations already drafted by his lawyer. It listed Emily's school schedule, living arrangements, even holiday plans for the next 3 years. Rebecca said she had never seen someone move this fast without making a single mistake, that Daniel must have been preparing every detail for months, while I told everyone he didn't care enough to react. By the end of that week, even Emily seemed to know something final was coming. She stayed close to Daniel in the evenings, followed him into the kitchen when he cooked dinner, sat next to him on the couch while he read through more papers with a highlighter in his hand. When I asked if she wanted to spend the weekend with me at Rebecca's place, she said she had homework and didn't look at me when she said it. I told myself there was still time to fix things, that Daniel was bluffing, that once he calmed down, we could talk like normal people and undo all this before it went too far. But when I passed his office late that night and saw him sliding another signed document into the growing stack on his desk, I realized he wasn't bluffing at all. The courthouse felt colder than I expected, even with the afternoon sun spilling through the high windows onto the polished floors. Rebecca came with me because she said I shouldn't face this alone, though she didn't look at me much as we sat outside the courtroom waiting for Daniel to arrive. He came in right on time, calm and steady as ever, dressed in the same dark suit he wore for work, carrying a folder so neatly organized it made my stomach twist. Lydia was with him, her face unreadable, while Emily stayed home with a neighbor because Daniel said she didn't need to see any of this. When the judge started reading through the paperwork, it felt like every word landed heavier than the one before. The divorce petition, the custody arrangements, the division of property, everything Daniel had been preparing for months was now laid out in calm, legal language that left no room for arguments. There were signed statements from banks, from Emily's school, even from people who had seen me living with Mark after I left the house. I wanted to interrupt, to tell the judge it wasn't like that I had only been trying to help someone who needed me, but the words felt small before I even opened my mouth. Daniel didn't speak until the judge asked if he had anything to add. He said he only wanted stability for Emily, clarity for the baby, and a clean ending so there would be no confusion about money, custody, or property later. His voice never rose above the same calm tone he used when reading bills at the kitchen table, and somehow that made it worse. There was no anger, no bitterness, no emotion left at all, just a man closing a door without slamming it, because slamming would mean he still cared enough to make noise. When it was my turn, I said Daniel was overreacting, that marriages survived worse than this, that people gossiped too much and turned everything into drama. The judge asked if any of the documents were false, if I disputed the timeline or the evidence Daniel had presented, and I had nothing to give him. Everything was dated, signed, confirmed, even screenshots of messages I didn't know Daniel had saved from months ago. He had built the whole case piece by piece, while I told everyone he was too quiet to do anything at all. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably beside me when the custody schedule was read out loud. School weeks with Daniel, alternating weekends with me, holidays already divided on paper like the ink knew more about the future than I did. Lydia sat behind Daniel the whole time with her hands folded in her lap, looking like someone who had known this was coming long before I even packed my suitcase to leave that first morning. When the judge granted Daniel primary custody of Emily and control over the house and finances until the baby was born, I tried to say it wasn't fair, that he was making me look like the villain while staying calm enough to make people believe him. The judge said the evidence spoke louder than anyone's feelings, that the decisions were final unless I had something concrete to challenge them with. I didn't. Daniel's lawyer handed over the rest of the paperwork, each page signed and stamped, the whole process neat enough to feel rehearsed. Daniel thanked the judge before gathering his folder and walking out without looking at me. He didn't stop to talk, didn't wait for Rebecca or Lydia, didn't acknowledge the dozen things I wanted to shout across the room. He just left the courthouse with the same steady steps he had taken through every part of this, like he had already moved on months before the judge read the first word. Lydia followed him out, pausing only to glance at me with the same expression she had worn since the night I left for Mark's apartment. Cold, certain, finished. Rebecca touched my arm like she wanted to say something but didn't, her eyes following Daniel through the glass doors as he crossed the parking lot toward his car. I stayed sitting on the hard bench long after the judge left the room, staring at the empty space where Daniel had stood while my marriage ended in a handful of sentences. I told Rebecca this wasn't what I wanted, that I had only needed time, that Daniel should have fought for me instead of signing everything away like it meant nothing. She said maybe this was his way of fighting, not with shouting or begging, but with signatures and custody agreements and locked drawers full of evidence I never saw until it was too late. Outside the courthouse, Daniel's car pulled away with Lydia in the passenger seat, the folder still on his lap like unfinished business, even though the judge had already stamped every page. Rebecca asked if I was ready to go, but I didn't answer right away because I was watching the taillights disappear down the road, realizing for the first time that Daniel hadn't left me in anger at all. He had left because he was done. By the time we walked to the car, the parking lot was almost empty. The courthouse steps wet from a brief rain that had passed while we were inside. I held the envelope of finalized papers against my chest, the pages warm from my hands but cold in every other way that mattered. Daniel had ended everything without a single raised voice, without one slammed door, without giving me anything to fight back against. And that, more than anything he'd written in those documents, made it clear there was nothing left to save. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching. 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 You are watching.